Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to tell you about something that sounds impossible. A love story buried in dirt. A romance fought with shovels instead of swords. And a man who spent 29 years of his life digging holes under one of history's most infamous barriers. This isn't a fairy tale. There's no magic here. Just mud, darkness, and the kind of stubborn, desperate love that refuses to accept walls, even when those walls are guarded by soldiers with orders to shoot on sight. Imagine being separated from the person you love most in the world by 100 meters of concrete and barbed wire. You can see their apartment from your window. You know they're right there, breathing the same air, living under the same sky, but you might as well be on different planets. Now imagine spending the next 3 decades trying to tunnel your way back to them. 17 different tunnels. Some collapsed, some were discovered, some got people killed. But you kept digging, year after year, through your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, until your hands were permanently scarred and your back was permanently bent. It starts on a summer night in 1961, when a city was torn in half, and ends 29 years later, when that same city learned to breathe again. But here's the thing about this story. It's not really about walls. It's about what happens when you love someone so much that giving up becomes impossible. Even when the entire world tells you to stop. Even when logic, reason, and common sense scream that you're wasting your life. Some people called him obsessed. Some called him crazy. Some called him a hero. He just called himself a man who missed his wife. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let me take you back to Berlin, 1961, to the night everything changed. Because this story doesn't start with digging, it starts with dance. August 13, 1961. The night Berlin broke. Berlin in the summer of 1961 was a city living on borrowed time, though most people didn't know it yet. The war had been over for 16 years, but the city was still divided. Not officially. Not with walls, just zones. The Soviet sector in the east, the American, British and French sectors in the west, and between them an invisible line that people crossed every day for work, for family, for love. Our man, let's call him Klaus, because his real name was lost to history and official records, lived in West Berlin. He was 26 years old, worked as an electrician, and was unremarkably happy. He had a small apartment, a decent job, and a wife named Ingrid, who lived 3 kilometers away in East Berlin, where she taught kindergarten. They'd met 2 years earlier at a dance hall that straddled the sector boundary. Half the building in the east, half in the west. You could literally dance across the border. That's where Klaus had first seen Ingrid, laughing with friends, her hair catching the light from the disco ball. They married 6 months later. It didn't matter that they lived in different sectors. Berlin was one city, even if it had 2 governments. People crossed the boundary every day. It was normal. Until it wasn't. On the night of August 12, 1961, Klaus and Ingrid had dinner together in East Berlin. Nothing special. Potato soup and bread. They talked about mundane things. Her students, his work, whether they should get a cat. Normal married couple conversation. He kissed her goodbye round 10 p.m. and headed back west. Same as he did every night. She stood at the window of her apartment and waved. He waved back. Neither of them knew it would be 29 years before they could touch again. At midnight, Soviet soldiers and East German police poured into the streets. They carried barbed wire, concrete posts, and orders that no one had expected. By dawn, Berlin was cut in half. Actually physically cut. Barbed wire stretched across roads. Soldiers stood at intersections, and anyone trying to cross was turned back at gunpoint. Klaus woke up to the news on the radio. At first, he didn't believe it. He threw on clothes and ran to the boundary. Surely this was temporary. Surely they'd let him through to see his wife. But the soldiers at the checkpoint shook their heads. No one crosses. Orders from Moscow. The border is closed. But my wife is over there, Klaus said, his voice rising with panic he couldn't control. Then you should have stayed on her side, a soldier replied, already looking past him to the next person in the growing crowd. Klaus stood at the barbed wire barrier. staring across at the east. He could see Ingrid's apartment building, 3 kilometers away. He could walk there in 40 minutes, under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. The wire might as well have been an ocean. It would come down in a few weeks, maybe a few months. It didn't. Within days, the wire was reinforced. Within weeks, concrete blocks appeared. Within months, a real wall rose from the ground, 3 meters high, topped with barbed wire backed by a death strip of raked sand, where footprints would show, where guards in towers could see everything, where mines were buried and dogs patrolled. The Berlin Wall, not a metaphor, a real physical barrier, cutting through a living city like a scar through flesh. Klaus tried everything legal first. He went to offices, filled out forms, stood in lines that stretched around blocks. He applied for visitation permits. He applied for passage permit. He applied for reunification documents. Every application was denied. The East German government had rules. No visits without compelling reasons. And I miss my wife wasn't compelling enough. He tried writing letters. The first few got through. Ingrid's responses were careful, obviously censored. She couldn't say much, just that she was okay, that she missed him, that she was waiting. Then the letters stopped. Either they weren't being delivered, or they weren't being allowed out. He had no way to know which. He stood at the wall every day after work. There were a few places where you could see over if you stood on something. He found a spot where if he climbed onto a pile of rubble and craned his neck, he could just barely see the corner of Ingrid's building. Sometimes if the light was right, he thought he could see movement in her window. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was hope playing tricks on his eyes. But he stood there anyway, watching, like a man staring at a photograph of a life he used to have. Other people gave up. Other separated families accepted the new reality. They mourned. They moved on. They started over. Berlin was full of people learning to live with loss. But Klaus couldn't let go. Every night, he lay in his empty apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking she's right there. 3 kilometers. I could walk there in 40 minutes. Except he couldn't. The wall said no. The guards said no. The entire apparatus of the East German state said no. And that's when Klaus started thinking about going under instead of over. That's how far Klaus lived from the wall. And 3 kilometers beyond the wall was Ingrid. He stood at his window every morning, drinking coffee, staring at the grey concrete barrier that had consumed his life. From this distance, it looked almost fake, like a movie. Surely something that absurd couldn't be real, but it was real, and it was growing. The East Germans were building more than just a wall. They were building a system. Behind the primary barrier was a second wall. Between the 2 walls was the death strip, a no man's land of sand, lights, guards and orders to shoot anyone who tried to cross. Klaus read the newspaper reports. People were trying to escape. Some were successful. Most weren't. He read about people shot while climbing the wall. People who bled out in the death strip while guards on both sides watched but couldn't help without starting an international incident. He read about tunnels. That's what got his attention. A group of students had dug a tunnel from a bakery in the west to a basement in the east. 30 people had escaped before the tunnel was discovered. The students were heroes. The tunnel was legendary. Klaus thought, if students can do it, why can't I? He had no engineering experience, no mining background. He'd never dug anything deeper than a garden bed, but he had motivation, and he had access to a basement apartment with a floor that might possibly, if he was lucky, be soft enough to dig through. He started researching. He went to libraries and read about soil composition, tunnel construction, and mining technique. He learned about shoring timbers, about the risk of collapse, about how to dispose of dirt without anyone noticing. It sounded impossible, insane, suicide, but the alternative was spending the rest of his life staring at a wall, knowing Ingrid was on the other side, growing older without him, maybe forgetting him, maybe giving up hope. So one night in October 1961, 2 months after the wall went up, Klaus moved his kitchen table, rolled back his thin carpet, and started digging. He used a gardening trowel at first, just a small hole. Experiment, to see if the floor was concrete or wood, to see if the soil beneath was clay or sand. It was wood, and beneath the wood, it was dirt, soft, dark, Berlin dirt. Klaus took that as a sign. He dug a little more, then a little more. By midnight he had a hole the size of a bucket. He looked down into the darkness he'd created and thought, this is insane, but he kept digging anyway, because sanity is a luxury, and Klaus had traded luxury for something else. Digging begins. The first night, Klaus dug for 4 hours and managed to excavate a hole about 1 meter deep. It doesn't sound like much, but when you're digging in secret, in your apartment, with only a trowel and your bare hands, 1 meter is an achievement. The dirt had to go somewhere. That was the first problem. He couldn't just pile it in his apartment. Someone would notice, so he filled old potato sacks, and every morning before work, carried them out like garbage, dumping them in different locations around the neighborhood. He told his landlord he was doing renovations. The landlord, who didn't care as long as the rent was paid, shrugged and said fine. Klaus worked every night. After his electrician job ended at 5, he'd come home, eat something quick, and dig until midnight or later. His hands developed blisters that turned into calluses. His back ached constantly. His knees were perpetually bruised from kneeling on hard dirt. But he was making progress. By the end of the first week, the hole was 2 meters deep. He dug straight down, creating a vertical shaft. Now came the hard part, digging horizontally, toward the wall, toward the east, toward Ingrid. He bought wooden planks and used them to shore up the shaft walls, preventing collapse. He wasn't an engineer, but he watched how construction workers did it and copied their techniques as best he could. The horizontal tunnel was different, harder, more claustrophobic. He had to lie on his stomach and push dirt backward with his hands. There was no room to swing a tool, no space to maneuver, just inches of clearance, darkness, and the constant fear that the ceiling would collapse and bury him alive. He worked by candlelight, one small flame in the tunnel with him consuming oxygen he needed, making the air thick and hard to breathe. But he needed to see, so he suffered the stale air and dug forward, centimeter by centimeter. After 2 months, he dug 20 meters, a fifth of the way to the wall. He was exhausted, filthy, and completely committed. This tunnel was his life now. His job was just the thing he did to pay for tools and food. His real work happened underground. But here's what Klaus hadn't accounted for. Water. Dig deep enough, and you hit moisture. Klaus hit it at 25 meters. At first it was just dampness. The walls got muddy, harder to dig through. Then it was puddles, water pooling at the lowest points, soaking his clothes, making the tunnel floor slick. Then it was flooding. One night, he was digging forward when water suddenly burst through the wall ahead. Not a lot, just a steady seep, but in a confined space. A steady seep is a crisis. Klaus scrambled backward, watching in horror as water filled the tunnel. He tried to bail it out with a bucket, but the water came faster than he could remove it. Within an hour, the entire tunnel was flooded knee-deep. He sat in his apartment, soaking wet, covered in mud, staring at the hole in his floor. 2 months of work. Ruined. The tunnel was unusable. Most people would have given up, accepted defeat, moved on. Klaus went to a hardware store and bought a hand pump. It took 3 days of constant pumping to drain the tunnel. His arms screamed. His shoulders felt like they were on fire. But he pumped until the water was gone, and the tunnel was merely damp instead of destroyed. Then he kept digging. He learned to shore up the walls better, to angle the tunnel slightly upward, to avoid water accumulation, to work faster when the soil was wet, slower when it was stable. The tunnel grew. 30 meters, 40 meters, 50 meters. He was past his apartment building now, under the street, under other people's basements, burrowing through Berlin like a mole with a mission. But the work was taking a toll. Klaus lost weight. He stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. His friends asked if he was sick. He said he was fine, just tired. Working a lot. He couldn't tell them the truth. Tunneling under the Berlin Wall was illegal. If the West German police found out, they'd stop. If the East German Stasi found out, they'd arrest Ingrid as an accomplice, even though she didn't know what he was doing. So Klaus suffered in silence, alone, in the dark, digging forward, always forward. He was 70 meters from his apartment when he heard the sound that every tunnel digger dreads, footsteps. Above him, heavy boots, marching in formation. East German border guards patrolling the death strip directly above his head. Klaus froze, held his breath, prayed the tunnel ceiling wouldn't collapse, that the guards wouldn't hear the hollow sound beneath their feet, that luck would hold just a little longer. The footsteps passed. Klaus exhaled and kept digging, because stopping wasn't an option, not when he was this close. Tunnel 1. Discovered tunnel. Klaus was 90 meters into the tunnel, just 10 meters from the wall, when everything went wrong. He was digging forward, same as every night, when he heard a different sound, not footsteps, something worse, voices, shouting, in German but not West German, East German, Stasi, Tessie. His heart stopped, his hands froze on the dirt. Had they found the tunnel? He scrambled backward, as fast as he could, crawling through the narrow passage, scraping his back on the low ceiling, panic overwhelming caution. He reached his apartment, climbed out of the hole, and listened. Sirens outside, not close, but not far either, in the direction of the wall. He risked looking out his window. Searchlights were sweeping the death strip. Guard towers were lit up like Christmas. Something was happening. Klaus learned the next day from whispered conversations in West Berlin. The Stasi had discovered a tunnel, not his tunnel, someone else's. A group of students digging from a different location. The tunnel had collapsed near the surface, creating a depression in the death strip that guards noticed during patrol. The students were arrested. The tunnel was filled with concrete, and the Stasi increased patrols, started using ground-penetrating equipment, and announced that anyone caught tunneling would be charged with treason. Klaus should have stopped. The risk was now exponentially higher. The Stasi was watched. His tunnel, still undetected, was now in an area under heightened scrutiny. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He was too close. He waited a week, let the heat die down, let the guards relax back into routine. Then he started digging again. He reached the wall 2 weeks later. His trowel hit concrete instead of dirt. He'd made it, 98 meters from his apartment to the base of the Berlin Wall. Now came the hardest part. Going under the wall without being detected, and surfacing in East Berlin without being shot. Klaus dug down, deep, beneath the wall's foundation. The wall itself was 3 meters high above ground, but its foundation went 2 meters deep. He had to go beneath that. He was 5 meters underground when his tunnel broke through to the other side. East Berlin. He could feel air moving, fresher air from a different ventilation source. He'd done it. He dug a tunnel under the Berlin Wall, but before he could go further, before he could dig up and surface and find Ingrid, disaster struck. A cave-in. The ceiling collapsed. Not the whole tunnel, just the section under the wall. Dirt and concrete chunks poured down, filling the passage, sealing it completely. Klaus barely escaped. He scrambled backward, coughing, choking on dust, as tons of earth filled the space he'd been occupying seconds before. He sat in his apartment, covered in dirt, and cried for the first time since the wall went up. 4 months of work, gone. The tunnel was destroyed, unusable. He'd have to start over. But the worst part, he'd been so close. 10 more meters and he would have surfaced in East Berlin. 10 more meters and he could have found Ingrid. Instead, he had nothing but a hole full of rubble, and the knowledge that next time, the Stasi might not miss him. Stasi Presento. Klaus didn't give up. He started planning a second tunnel. But before he could begin digging, something worse happened. Someone reported him. He never found out who. Maybe a neighbor who noticed the dirt. Maybe his landlord, who got suspicious. Maybe just bad luck. But one morning, there was a knock on his door. West German police. Not Stasi, thank God. But still, police, with a warrant. They searched his apartment and found the tunnel entrance. They asked questions. Why was he digging? Where was he trying to go? Did he know tunneling was illegal? Klaus told them the truth. He was trying to reach his wife in East Berlin. He wasn't trying to help people escape. He just wanted to see Ingrid again. The police were sympathetic but firm. What he was doing was dangerous. If the Stasi caught him, they'd arrest him and probably charge Ingrid as an accomplice. He was putting her at risk by continuing. They made him fill in the tunnel, ordered him to stop digging, warned him that if they caught him again, he'd face charges. Klaus nodded, said he understood, promised to stop. He lied. But he didn't dig from his apartment anymore. Too much attention. Instead, he found a derelict building closer to the wall. An abandoned warehouse, scheduled for demolition. Perfect. He broke in at night, found a suitable location in the basement, and started digging tunnel number 2. He was more careful this time, told no one, worked only at night, disposed of dirt in different locations, used better shoring techniques, learned from his mistakes. This tunnel progressed faster. He was experienced now, knew what to expect. 60 meters in 3 months. But then the warehouse was scheduled for earlier demolition. Klaus had to evacuate his tunnel before the building came down. He salvaged what tools he could and abandoned the rest. 2 tunnels, both failures. But he wasn't done. He'd start a 3rd, and a 4th, and a 5th if necessary. But before he could start again, something unexpected happened. The Stesi caught someone else, a man who'd been helping Klaus with supplies. Someone Klaus had trusted. The man under interrogation gave Klaus his name. And suddenly, Klaus wasn't just on the West German police's radar. He was on the Stesi's list. One night, Klaus made a mistake. He crossed into East Berlin using forged papers, just to get close, just to see Ingrid's building, just to know she was still there. The Stesi was waiting. They arrested him at the checkpoint, and suddenly, Klaus's nightmare got much worse. Release and resolve. Stesi prison was a grey concrete box where time moved differently. Days bled into each other. Klaus was interrogated repeatedly. Who helped you? Who paid for supplies? Are you a Western spy? He told them the truth. No one helped him. He paid for everything himself. And he wasn't a spy. He just wanted to see his wife. They didn't believe him. To the Stesi, everything was a conspiracy. No one acted alone. There had to be Western intelligence involved. Klaus endured 3 months of interrogation. He was never physically tortured, but the psychological pressure was constant. Sleep deprivation, isolation, threats against Ingrid. But he never gave them anything, because there was nothing to give. He really was just a man who missed his wife. Eventually, even the Stesi got bored. Klaus wasn't a spy. He wasn't part of a conspiracy. He was just stubborn and foolish. They decided he wasn't worth the effort. Through a West German diplomatic channel, they arranged his release. He was expelled back to West Berlin, with a warning. If he tried to tunnel again, next time they'd charge Ingrid. Klaus stood on the western side of the wall again, free but defeated. The Stesi had made their message clear. If he kept digging, Ingrid would suffer. Any reasonable person would have stopped, would have accepted that love, no matter how strong, has limits, that some walls can't be breached. But Klaus looked at the concrete barrier, thought about Ingrid on the other side, and started planning tunnel number 3. Because here's the thing about obsession. It doesn't listen to reason. It doesn't respond to threats. It just digs. Deeper, harder, more carefully. Klaus would be more cautious now, smarter. He wouldn't get caught again, and he wouldn't put Ingrid at risk. But he wouldn't stop digging either. Tunnel 2. Deeper. This time, Klaus learned from his mistakes. Tunnel 3 would be different. Deeper, to avoid detection equipment. More carefully concealed, and in a location the Stesi would never think to look. He found a garden allotment on the western edge of the city, a small plot where West Berliners grew vegetables. Klaus rented a plot, built a small shed, and started digging beneath it. From the outside, he looked like every other amateur gardener, tending tomatoes, watering lettuce. But beneath his shed, he was excavating a tunnel that would eventually stretch 120 meters. This tunnel was his masterpiece. 4 meters deep to avoid seismic detection, carefully shored with stolen lumber, ventilated with a hand-pumped air system. He even installed a small rail system, using toy train tracks to move dirt more efficiently. It took him 8 months. He worked every evening, and all weekend. His fingers were permanently stained with dirt. His back was a permanent catalogue of pain. But the tunnel grew. He was 90 meters in, when he hit an underground pipe. Not a water pipe, thankfully. A gas line. Old. Probably unused. But still potentially dangerous. One spark in the tunnel would explode. Klaus had to redirect, dig around the pipe. This added 30 meters to his route. and 3 more months to his timeline. But he kept going, because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant accepting that he'd never see Ingrid again. Finally, after 11 months of digging, his tunnel reached the point directly beneath Ingrid's apartment building. He was under East Berlin, under her home, so close he could almost feel her presence above him. Now came the terrifying part. Surface, breaking through into a basement in East Berlin, without being caught. Klaus dug upward, slowly, carefully, listening for sounds above, praying the basement was empty, praying his calculations were correct. His trowel broke through. He could see actual daylight filtering down through cracks in floorboards. He widened the hole, made it large enough to climb through, and one night, in the darkest hours before dawn, Klaus emerged in East Berlin, for the first time in 2 years, empty except for old furniture and boxes. Perfect. He climbed out of his tunnel, brushed himself off, and stood on East German soil. Illegal, treasonous, completely and utterly worth it. Ingrid lived 3 floors up. He was terrified, exhilarated. So close, but he couldn't just knock on her door. The Stasi watched her. If he was seen, they'd both be arrested. He needed a plan, a signal, a way to let her know he was here without alerting anyone else. But before he could figure it out, he heard voices. German, harsh, official, Stasi in the building, coming down the stairs. Klaus dove back into the tunnel, pulled a board over the entrance, held his breath. Footsteps passed above him. Voices faded, but the message was clear. The building was being watched. He couldn't risk trying to reach Ingrid. Not yet. He retreated through the tunnel, back to West Berlin, back to his shed, back to trying to figure out how to close the final impossible distance between himself and the woman he loved. Tunnel 3 was technically successful. He'd reached East Berlin, but he was no closer to actually seeing Ingrid, and that might be the cruelest success of all. Breakthrough. By 1965, Klaus had been digging for 4 years. He'd lost count of the hours spent underground. His body was a map of injuries, scars from cave-ins, chronic back pain, fingers that didn't quite straighten anymore. But he'd also gotten better, smarter. He'd learned which routes worked and which didn't, where the Stasi patrols concentrated, which buildings had basements that weren't watched. Tunnel 4 was his most ambitious yet. Instead of digging toward Ingrid's building, which was clearly under surveillance, he dug toward a church basement 2 blocks away, a place where people gathered for services, where Stasi presence was lighter, because monitoring churches created bad optics. He recruited help this time, carefully, 3 other people, a friend from work, a university student whose girlfriend was trapped in the east, and a retired engineer who knew proper tunnel construction. With 4 people working in shifts, the tunnel progressed rapidly. 6 months to dig 140 meter, a proper tunnel, tall enough to crouch in, properly shored with electric lights run from a generator above. They broke through into the church basement on a Tuesday in October. Klaus was the first one through. He stood in the darkness of an East Berlin church basement, heart pounding, barely believing he'd made it. Now came the hard part, getting word to people who wanted to escape, including Ingrid. They couldn't just knock on doors, they had to be subtle. The church pastor, who opposed the regime but was careful about it, helped spread the word. A message passed through, whispered conversations. If you want to leave, be at the church basement on Friday night at midnight. Klaus managed to get a message to Ingrid, a coded letter that somehow made it through the mail system. 3 words: Friday, midnight, church. She'd understand, or she wouldn't. Klaus had no way to know if the letter reached her, if she understood, if she'd come. He just had to wait and hope. 12 people crawled to freedom. Friday night, Klaus waited in the church basement with his 3 friends. They'd brought food and water, blankets, first aid supplies, everything they might need. Midnight approached. No one came. Maybe the message hadn't gotten through. Maybe people were too scared. Maybe this whole thing was a trap. Then at 12:07, the basement door creaked open. A woman appeared, middle-aged, frightened. She saw Klaus and whispered, "Is this the tunnel?" Klaus nodded. She descended the stairs. Behind her came a man, then a teenage boy, then an elderly couple. They kept coming. 12 people total. Families, individuals, all desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Klaus's heart soared and sank simultaneously. 12 people, but Ingrid wasn't among them. He wanted to wait, to give her more time, but the risk grew with every passing minute. The longer they stayed, the more likely they'd be discovered. The first person entered the tunnel, then the second. Klaus helped them one by one, showing them how to crawl, warning them about low sections, encouraging them forward. It took 2 hours for all 12 to traverse the tunnel. 2 hours of agonizing progress. At one point, someone panicked, started hyperventilating, nearly turned back. Klaus talked them through it, calm voice in the darkness. Just keep moving. You're almost there. Freedom is just ahead. When the last person emerged in West Berlin, there was crying, hugging, disbelief. They'd made it. They were free. But Klaus felt hollow, empty. 12 successful escapes, a triumph by any measure, but the one person he'd built the tunnel for hadn't come. Where was Ingrid? Had she gotten the message? Was she too scared? Was she under surveillance? Or worse, had something happened to her? Klaus had no answers, just the crushing weight of success that felt like failure. She didn't come. Calm. Klaus returned to the church basement every night for a week, hoping Ingrid had just missed the first escape, that she'd come tonight, or tomorrow, or the next day. But the tunnel was compromised. The Stasi had noticed the missing families. They were investigating. It was only a matter of time before they found the church basement entrance. On the 7th night, Klaus's engineer friend grabbed his arm. We have to seal the tunnel. It's too dangerous. Klaus knew he was right, but sealing the tunnel meant giving up on Ingrid. Again. They filled the tunnel entrance with concrete, destroyed all evidence, and Klaus walked home, through the streets of West Berlin, feeling more alone than ever. He learned later, through secret channels, what had happened. Ingrid had received his message. She'd wanted to come, but the Stasi had visited her apartment that very Friday. A routine they'd stayed for hours, asking questions, making sure she wasn't planning anything foolish. By the time they left, it was too late to reach the church safely. She'd missed her chance, and the tunnel was sealed before she could try again. Klaus sat in his apartment staring at the wall, and realized the cruel irony. He'd successfully evacuated 12 people. He was a hero to their families, but the only person he cared about saving was still trapped, and he'd have to start over, again, dig another tunnel, find another route, spend another year underground. Some men would have broken, would have accepted defeat, would have found someone else to love, and tried to move on. But Klaus wasn't some men. He was a man who'd already spent 4 years digging, and 4 more years wouldn't kill him, probably. He just had to keep going, keep trying, keep believing that eventually, somehow, he'd find a way, even if it took forever. Tunnel 3, 4, 5. The years blurred together. 1966, 1967, 1968. Klaus kept digging. Tunnel 5 started from an abandoned factory. Tunnel 6 from a cemetery. The dead didn't report suspicious activity. Tunnel 7 from beneath a wine cellar. Some tunnels collapsed, some were discovered. Some hit impassable obstacles, concrete foundations, subway tunnels, underground rivers. Each failure hurt less. Not because Klaus cared less, but because he'd learned to compartmentalize pain. Each collapsed tunnel was just data, information about what didn't work, which meant he was closer to finding what would work. His life became a routine of obsession. Work his day job, dig at night, sleep a few hours, repeat. He stopped seeing friends, stopped maintaining his apartment, stopped caring about anything except the next tunnel. People asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. They stopped believing him. Eventually, they stopped asking. By 1970, Klaus was 35 years old. He'd spent 9 years digging. 9 years without touching his wife. 9 years of his life consumed by dirt and darkness. His body was breaking down, chronic pain in his back and knees. His hearing was damaged from years in confined spaces. His lungs were scarred from breathing bad air. But he kept digging. Tunnel 8 reached 60 meters before hitting bedrock. Tunnel 9 collapsed, nearly killing Klaus when the ceiling came down. He escaped with a broken arm and returned to digging 3 weeks later, cast and all. The East German government kept improving their detection methods, ground sensors, regular patrols with dogs trained to smell disturbed earth, satellite surveillance. But Klaus adapted. He dug deeper, moved slower, used different tools. He became an expert in underground construction, learning through trial and error what engineers spent years studying. And through it all, he held on to one thought. Ingrid is waiting. The collapsed tunnel. Tunnel 10 almost killed him. He was 70 meters in, working alone at 3 in the morning, when he felt it, a subtle shift in the earth above him, a whisper of movement that triggered every survival instinct he developed over a decade of tunneling. He scrambled backward, fast as he could, but not fast enough. The ceiling collapsed, tons of earth pouring down, filling the tunnel, burying everything. Klaus was caught, his legs pinned under a pile of dirt and broken shoring timbers, his upper body free, but only barely. The dust was so thick he couldn't see, couldn't breathe properly, could only cough and gasp and try not to panic. He was alone. No one knew where he was. If he died here, they might not find his body for years. He tried to move, couldn't. His legs were completely immobilized. He tried to dig himself out with his hands, but for every handful of dirt he moved, more poured in to replace it. He was trapped. Hours passed. Klaus drifted in and out of consciousness. His lips were cracked. His throat was dust. His mind wandered between memory and hallucination. He saw Ingrid, young, smiling, dancing at that club where they'd met. She was reaching for him. He was reaching back, but he couldn't quite touch her fingers. Then he heard something, a voice. Real or imagined? He couldn't tell. Klaus, where are you? His friend from work, the one who knew about the tunnels, who'd helped with Tunnel 4, who'd gotten worried when Klaus didn't show up for their weekly beer. The friend had found the tunnel entrance, had heard Klaus's weak calls for help. It took 4 hours to dig Klaus out. When they finally pulled him free, both his legs were badly injured, possibly broken. He couldn't walk. An ambulance took him to the hospital. The doctors asked what happened. Klaus said he fell in a construction site. They didn't believe him, but they also didn't push. 6 weeks in the hospital, 2 months of physical therapy, and the whole time Klaus was planning Tunnel 11. Because almost dying wasn't enough to make him stop. Nothing was enough. Obsession or love. The cult people started using the word obsessed more often. Klaus's few remaining friends staged an intervention. This isn't healthy, they said. You need to let go, move on, find someone else. Klaus listened politely, nodded, said he understood their concern, then went back to digging. Was it obsession? Probably. Was it love? Also yes. The line between the two had blurred so completely that Klaus couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He knew intellectually that his behavior wasn't normal, that a sane person would have given up years ago, that he was wasting his life chasing something that might be impossible. But he also knew that without this quest, without this goal, his life would be empty. The tunnels gave him purpose, gave him reason to wake up every morning, gave him something to fight for. If that was obsession, then fine, he'd be obsessed. The wall had stolen his wife, but it wouldn't steal his will. That was the one thing Klaus still controlled. So he kept digging, through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Tunnel 12, 13, 14, some lasted days, some lasted months. None reached Ingrid, but each one taught him something. About the soil, about Berlin's underground geography, about his own limits, and how to push past them. Klaus was no longer just a man digging a tunnel. He was a machine, a force of nature, unstoppable, relentless, possibly insane, but undeniably, absolutely, refusing to quit. Tunnel 9. So close, Dick. In 1977, 16 years after the wall went up, Klaus started Tunnel 15. And this one was different. This one was going to work. He could feel it. He'd found the perfect location, an old coal cellar near the border. Deep, dry, structurally sound, and with a direct route to a building in East Berlin where Ingrid had recently moved. He'd kept track of her through letters that occasionally made it through messages passed via Western journalists who visited East Berlin. He knew where she lived. He knew she was still there, still waiting. Tunnel 15 progressed beautifully. No water problems, no cave-ins. Klaus was in the zone, digging with the efficiency of a man who'd done this 17 times before. 3 months later, he broke through. East Berlin, right where he'd planned, a basement storage room in an apartment building. Ingrid lived on the 3rd floor. Klaus was so close, closer than he'd ever been. He waited until night, climbed out of the tunnel, ascended the basement stairs. The building was quiet, most residents asleep. He reached Ingrid's floor, found her apartment number, raised his hand to knock. Then heard voices, German, official Stasi. They were in the building, right now, conducting a random sweep, checking papers, looking for anything suspicious. Klaus froze. If he knocked, if Ingrid opened the door, they'd both be arrested. The Stasi was 20 meters away. He had to retreat, had to leave, had to go back down to the tunnel and escape before they found him. But he was so close. 5 more seconds, and he could have seen her, touched her, held her for the first time in 16 years. Klaus stood there paralyzed by indecision, until the Stasi voices got louder, closer, coming this way. He ran, down the stairs, into the basement, into the tunnel, pulled the cover over the entrance behind him, and crawled as fast as he could back to West Berlin. So close. 5 seconds, that's all he'd needed. 5 seconds, and terrible timing had stolen it from him. Guard dogs and patrol. The Stasi were getting better at finding tunnels. They had teams now, specialists, people whose entire job was detecting and destroying escape routes. They used dogs trained to smell disturbed earth. They used ground-penetrating radar. They interviewed residents in buildings near the wall, looking for suspicious activity. Klaus had to adapt. Again, he started digging even deeper, 6 meters down, deep enough that sensors couldn't detect him, deep enough that dogs couldn't smell him. But deeper meant slower, harder, more dangerous. The risk of collapse increased exponentially with depth. Tunnel 16 started in 1979, took 9 months to dig just 80 meters. The soil at that depth was different, harder, clay-like. Klaus's tools kept breaking. He had to retrofit new equipment, improvise solutions, and the deeper he went, the less air there was. Klaus worked in oxygen-starved conditions, taking breaks every few minutes to breathe properly, fighting off dizziness and nausea. He lost weight, not intentionally. He just forgot to eat. The tunnel consumed everything. His time, his energy, his attention. Food was an afterthought. Friends stopped visiting. Not because they didn't care, but because Klaus had become someone they didn't recognize. A hollow-eyed man who talked only about soil composition and shoring techniques. The wall had separated Klaus from Ingrid, but obsession had separated Klaus from everyone else. Mapping the underground over 18 years, Klaus had dug so many tunnels that he'd created an unintentional map of underground Berlin. He knew where every obstacle was, every pipe, every foundation, every problem waiting to be encountered. Other tunnel diggers started seeking him out. Quietly, secretly, Klaus had become a legend in the small, desperate community of people trying to breach the wall. They asked for advice, asked to see his maps, asked if he'd help them with their tunnels. Klaus helped when he could, not for money, not for recognition, but because he understood. He understood the desperation that drove people to dig through solid earth with hand tools and hope. He shared his knowledge, where to dig, where not to dig, which tools worked best, how to shore properly, how to dispose of dirt, how to avoid detection. Some people succeeded because of Klaus's advice. Families were reunited, lives were saved, and Klaus felt nothing. No satisfaction, because none of those successes were his success. Ingrid was still in East Berlin, and Klaus was still in the West, and the wall was still standing. That was the only measure of success that mattered. The tunnel networks. By the 1980s, Klaus realized he wasn't alone. There were dozens of diggers throughout West Berlin, maybe hundreds, all trying to reach the east, all driven by the same desperate hope. Some were professionals, engineers who understood construction. Some were amateurs, students, factory workers, ordinary people driven to extraordinary efforts by love or ideology. They formed an accidental network. Information passed through whispers in bars, coded messages in newspapers, brief meetings in safe houses. Klaus became a resource, the old man who'd been digging longer than anyone, who'd failed more times than anyone, who'd learnt more than anyone. Younger diggers treated him with a mixture of respect and pity, respect for his knowledge and dedication, pity for what he'd become, a ghost of a man, consumed by an impossible quest. But Klaus didn't want pity. He just wanted Ingrid. Some of the other tunnels succeeded. People escaped. The community celebrated. Klaus celebrated with them, genuinely happy for their success. But each success was also a reminder of his failure. 20 years, 16 tunnels, thousands of hours underground, and he was no closer to Ingrid than he'd been in 1961. Klaus knew of at least 6 diggers who died underground, cave-ins mostly, buried alive in the darkness, suffocated by the earth they'd been trying to move. One man drowned when his tunnel hit an underground stream. Another died of a heart attack while digging, his body not found for 3 days. Klaus had been to their funerals, stood silent as their families wept, and wondered if he'd be next, if one day his tunnel would become his tomb. But the deaths didn't deter him. If anything, they reinforced his commitment. Those men had died trying. Klaus would honor their sacrifice by continuing, by refusing to let fear stop him. He adopted new safety measures, always told someone where he was digging, always carried a whistle to signal for help, always checked his tunnel more carefully before entering. But the risk remained. Underground work was inherently dangerous, and Klaus had been doing it for 2 decades. The odds were catching up. Brotherhood of diggers. Despite the danger, despite the failures, there was a strange camaraderie among the diggers, a brotherhood of the they understood each other in ways no one else could. The aching muscles, the perpetual smell of earth, the way dirt got under your fingernails and never quite came out, the dreams of collapse and suffocation. They helped each other, shared tools, shared information, covered for each other when someone needed an alibi or explanation. Klaus, the oldest and most experienced, became an unofficial leader, not by choice, just by virtue of having survived longer than anyone else. Young diggers would find him and ask, "How do you keep going? How do you not give up?" Klaus never had a good answer. He just kept digging, because the alternative, stopping, was unthinkable. One young man asked him once, "Do you think you'll ever make it? Do you think you'll ever reach her?" Klaus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know, but I know I'll die trying, and that's enough." The young man nodded, understanding something he hadn't understood before. This wasn't about success. It was about refusing to accept defeat. It was about saying, the wall doesn't get to win. Love doesn't get to lose. Even if it takes forever, even if it kills you, you keep digging. Bill Rio, 20 years underground batting. By 1981, Klaus had been digging for 20 years, half his life. The Berlin Wall had been standing longer than it had been down. Klaus was 46 now. His hair was grey, his body was wrecked. He looked 60, felt 70, but his hands still knew how to dig. Tunnel 17 started in a small warehouse near the wall. Klaus had bought the building using money he'd saved over 20 years. It was his, no landlord to ask questions, no one to tell him to stop. This tunnel would be different, deeper than any before, better engineered, using knowledge accumulated over 2 decades of failure. Klaus hired an architect, told him he was building a basement wine cellar, and got professional plans for underground construction. Then he adapted those plans for tunneling. He worked alone now. Most of his old allies were gone, dead, moved away, or given up. Klaus didn't mind. He'd always been alone anyway. The tunnel progressed slowly, 1 meter per week, but progress was progress. By 1985, he'd dug 110 meters, the longest tunnel he'd ever created, and it was stable, solid, a masterpiece of amateur engineering. He was exhausted. Every day was pain. But he was close. So close. No longer young. Klaus looked at himself in the mirror one morning and barely recognized the face staring back. When had he gotten so old? When had the lines become so deep? When had his hands become so gnarled? 24 years. That's when. He was 49 years old. Ingrid was 47. They'd been separated for nearly a quarter century. More than half their marriage spent apart. Did she even remember him? Did she still love him, or had time eroded what the wall couldn't destroy? Klaus didn't let himself think about that, because thinking led to doubt, and doubt led to quitting. He just kept digging, one handful of earth at a time. His body was failing. His doctor warned him. The constant physical strain was destroying him. His heart was weak. His lungs were scarred. His back was beyond repair. If you don't stop, the doctor said, this work will kill you. Klaus thanked him for the warning and kept digging, because what was the alternative? Stop? Give up? Accept that he'd wasted 24 years? Accept that Ingrid would remain forever on the other side of that wall? No, he'd rather die digging than live with that. Letters through the wall. Occasionally a letter from Ingrid made it through, censored, carefully worded, but unmistakably her. She wrote about small things, the weather, her students she was still teaching, the flowers in her window box. Nothing political, nothing that would trigger the sense, but between the lines, Klaus could read what she wasn't saying. I'm still here. I'm still waiting. Don't give up. Klaus wrote back. His letters were similarly careful. He talked about his construction work, his projects, nothing specific, nothing incriminating, but she'd know, she'd understand. I'm still digging. I'm still trying. I haven't forgotten. The letters were a lifeline, proof that they were both still alive, still connected, still fighting, and they gave Klaus the strength to keep going, even when his body screamed to stop, even when logic said it was impossible. Because love doesn't listen to logic. Love just digs. The final tunnel begins. In 1987, Klaus started what he swore would be his final tunnel, not because he was giving up, but because his body couldn't take another one after this. This was it, his last chance. He chose his starting point carefully, directly under his own apartment. He'd bought the building years ago specifically for this possibility. No landlords, no neighbors, just Klaus and his tunnel. This time, he wasn't going to rush, wasn't going to take chances. This tunnel would be perfect, or he'd die trying. He hired a mining engineer under false pretenses, paying for a consultation on theoretical underground construction. The engineer gave him plans, calculations, safety recommendations. Klaus followed every guideline. He over-engineered everything. Triple shored the walls, installed ventilation systems, created emergency exits. This wasn't just a tunnel anymore. This was an underground highway, a monument to 26 years of obsession. The work went slowly, but it went well. No major problems, no cave-ins, no discoveries. Klaus was 70 meters in when the Berlin Wall started showing cracks. Not literal cracks, political ones. The Soviet Union was weakening. East Germany was struggling. Protests were growing. People were whispering, things are changing. But Klaus didn't dare hope. He'd been hurt too many times, disappointed too often. He just kept digging, flooding, and collapse. At 80 meters, Klaus hit water, again, like his first tunnel, all those years ago. But this time, he was prepared. He had pumps, multiple pumps, industrial grade. He pumped constantly, 24 hours a day, keeping the water at bay while he dug through the wet section. It took 3 months to get past the water table. 3 months of back-breaking work, constant pumping, and the fear that one pump failure would flood years of work, but he made it through. 90 meters, 100, 110. He was so close to East Berlin, so close to Ingrid, just a little further. Then, at 115 meters, the tunnel collapsed. Not the whole thing, just a 10-meter section. But it was right in the middle. The tunnel was cut in two. Klaus stood at the edge of the collapse, staring at tons of fallen earth, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Despair. He was too old, too tired, too broken. He didn't have the strength to clear this, didn't have the time to dig around it. 26 years, 17 tunnels, thousands of hours, and he was going to fail. Again. Klaus sat in the darkness of his tunnel and cried, not quiet tears, deep, body-shaking sobs, the accumulated grief of 2.5 decades pouring out. And when he was done crying, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He started digging. Again, one last push. It took Klaus 2 months to clear the collapse and stabilize the tunnel, 2 months of the hardest work of his life. His heart was struggling. He could feel it. Irregular beats, chest pain, shortness of breath. His doctor during a checkup was alarmed. "You need to rest. Your heart can't take much more strain." Klaus nodded, said he'd take it easy, went back to digging. By October 1989, he'd reached 130 meters. He was under East Berlin, under Ingrid's neighborhood. Just a little more, just a few more weeks. But then something happened that Klaus hadn't anticipated, something that changed everything. The wall was coming down. The announcement day. Klaus was underground, digging, when he heard the news, a radio broadcast, carried down through his ventilation shaft. The East German government, under pressure from massive protests, had announced the border was opening. Effective immediately, people could cross freely. Klaus stopped digging. Sat in the darkness, listened to the broadcast again. It couldn't be real. It had to be a trick, a test. The Stasi trying to identify dissidents. But the broadcast continued. Crowds were gathering at the wall. People were crossing through checkpoints. Guards were letting them through. The Berlin Wall, after 28 years, was opening. Klaus climbed out of his tunnel, walked to the nearest checkpoint, saw the crowds. The celebration, the tears. People were crossing, actually crossing. No one was stopping them. It was real. The wall was open. 29 years. Klaus stood at the checkpoint, staring at the open gate, and felt nothing. Not joy, not relief, not even satisfaction. Just emptiness, numbness, shock. 28 years, 11 months, and 26 days since the wall went up. Nearly 29 years. He'd spent that entire time digging. 17 tunnels, thousands of hours underground, his entire adult life consumed by the quest to breach a barrier that was now, suddenly, inexplicably, open. What was he supposed to feel? Relief that it was finally over, anger that he'd wasted so much time, grief for the years lost. Klaus felt all of it. And none of it, just a vast hollow emptiness, where his purpose used to be. A young couple rushed past him, laughing, crying, celebrating their freedom. Klaus watched them go and thought, I spent my life trying to create moments like that, and now it's just over. The tunnel beneath his apartment, 130 meters long, perfectly engineered, representing 29 years of work, was suddenly useless. Obsolete, a monument to effort that was no longer needed. Klaus started laughing, not happy laughter, the slightly unhinged laughter of a man whose entire worldview had just evaporated. But then a thought cut through the shock. Ingrid, the wall was open, which meant Klaus started running. Walking through the gate, Klaus joined the crowd at the checkpoint. Thousands of people, all trying to cross simultaneously. East Germans coming west, West Germans going east, families reuniting after 3 decades. The guards weren't checking papers, weren't stopping anyone. They just waved people through, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Klaus crossed the border for the first time in 29 years. Not through a tunnel, through a gate, walking upright, in daylight. It felt surreal, wrong, like cheating, like all those years of digging had been for nothing. But he was in East Berlin now, legally, freely, and Ingrid was somewhere in this city. Klaus ran through streets he'd only seen on maps, past buildings he'd spent years trying to tunnel under. The city was transformed, crowds everywhere, people celebrating, drinking, singing, crying. He reached Ingrid's building, the same building he'd tried to reach 17 times through 17 different tunnels. He climbed the stairs. His heart was pounding, not from exertion, from 29 years of anticipation finally reaching their crescendo. He reached her floor, found her apartment, the door he'd dreamed about for 3 decades. Klaus raised his hand, hesitated. What if she wasn't there? What if she'd moved? What if she'd given up on him? What if... He knocked, seeing her again. The door opened, and there she was. Ingrid, older, grey hair, lines on her face, but unmistakably her. The woman he'd married 31 years ago. The woman he'd spent 29 years trying to reach. They stared at each other, silent, neither moving, neither speaking, just looking, relearning faces that had aged in separation. Klaus noticed everything. How her eyes were the same, how her hands trembled slightly, how she was crying without making a sound. Ingrid saw a stranger and her husband simultaneously, a man she'd loved who'd become a ghost in her memory, now solid and real, and standing in her doorway. Her voice was uncertain, like she didn't quite believe what she was seeing. "It's me," he said. His voice cracked. "I'm here. I'm really here." And then they were holding each other, not gently, desperately, clutching each other like drowning people clutching debris, making sure this was real, that this wasn't another dream, or hallucination or cruel trick. Klaus buried his face in her hair and breathed in. She smelled different, 29 years different, but underneath the unfamiliarity was something he recognized, something that said her. "I tried," Klaus whispered. "I tried so hard to get to you. I dug 17 tunnels. I spent every day." "I know," Ingrid said. She was crying now, actually crying. "I know. I heard about the tunnels, about what you were doing. I waited. I always waited." They stood in her doorway, holding each other, while the world celebrated around them. The Berlin Wall was falling. History was being made, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was this. 2 people, separated by concrete and ideology, and impossible distance, finally touching again. "What do you say after 29 years? They sat in Ingrid's small apartment, holding hands, trying to figure out what to say, where to start, how to compress nearly 3 decades into words. Ingrid spoke first. "I got your letters. Not all of them, but some. I knew you hadn't forgotten." Klaus nodded. "I could never forget. Not for a second. I wanted to come to the tunnels." Ingrid continued. "That first one, the one at the church. I tried. But the Stasi." "I know," Klaus said. "I heard. It wasn't your fault." Silence, comfortable and uncomfortable simultaneously. 29 years, Ingrid said softly. "We missed so much. Birthdays, holidays, life." "I know. Was it worth it?" she asked. Not accusatory, just genuinely curious. All that time, all that effort, was it worth it? Klaus looked at her, at the woman he'd spent half his life trying to reach, at the goal that had consumed him, broken him, defined him. "Yes," he said simply. "Every second, because I'm here now, with you." Ingrid smiled. It was a sad smile, a smile that acknowledged pain and loss and wasted years, but also a smile that said, "But we're here. We survived. We made it." They talked through the night, not about grand things, just small things, catching up, filling in gaps, learning who they'd become during the separation. Klaus told her about the tunnels, not all 17. That would take weeks, just the memorable ones. The first, the one that almost killed him, the final one he'd abandoned just today. Ingrid told him about her life in East Berlin, surviving, waiting, never dating anyone else, because she was married. even if her husband was on the other side of an impossible wall. As dawn broke, they were still talking, still holding hands, still unable to quite believe this was real. Love that moved mountains and dirt. Over the following weeks, Klaus and Ingrid began the hard work of rebuilding a marriage that had been frozen for 3 decades. It wasn't easy. They were strangers now, different people than the young couple who danced at that club. They had to relearn each other, figure out if the love that had survived separation could survive reunion. But slowly, tentatively, they found their way back to each other. She stood at the entrance, looking down into the darkness he'd created, and wept. "You really did this," she said. "For me, you really spent your life." "I'd do it again," Klaus said, and meant it. Ingrid laughed, actually laughed. Let's just use doors from now on." The Berlin Wall fell completely within months, literally torn down by people with hammers and bare hands. Klaus and Ingrid went to watch, saw crowds destroying the barrier that had defined their lives. Klaus picked up a chunk of concrete, a piece of the wall. He held it, felt its weight, and then threw it as hard as he could. "Fuck you," he said to the wall, to the concrete, to the 3 decades of separation. "You didn't win." Ingrid took his hand. "No," she agreed. "We did." Klaus and Ingrid lived another 20 years together. Not always easy years. They had a lot of time to make up for, a lot of trauma to process, a lot of adjusting to do. But he also never filled in the one under his apartment. It stayed there, a reminder, a monument, proof that love, real love, doesn't accept barriers. It just digs back to your warm bed, and you open your eyes. Not in Berlin, not in 1989, but here, now, in your comfortable bed, in your safe home, in a world where walls like that don't exist anymore. It was just a story, a history lesson, wrapped in narrative, but it was also real. Klaus was real. Ingrid was real. The 17 tunnels were real. Thousands of people spent decades trying to breach the Berlin Wall. Some succeeded, most didn't. Klaus was one of thousands who dug, who tried, who refused to accept separation. And now, you're awake. And the world is different. You can go anywhere you want, talk to anyone, love anyone. No walls, no checkpoints, no guards with orders to shoot. It's easy to take that freedom for granted, to forget that for millions of people, for decades, the simplest things, seeing family, holding someone you love, were impossible. Klaus spent 29 years digging through dirt. You can cross continents in hours. You can video call anyone on Earth. You can be with the people you love without needing a tunnel. Maybe tonight, as you drift back to sleep, you'll appreciate that a little more. The freedom to love without barrier. The ability to reach the people who matter without needing to dig through concrete. And maybe, if you're really lucky, you'll never know what it's like to be separated from someone you love by a wall you can see but can't cross. Klaus knew. Ingrid knew. Millions knew. But you don't have to, because the wall fell, and Klaus's 17 tunnels, useless as they ultimately were, represented something that walls can never contain, the human refusal to accept defeat. So sleep well, love freely, and remember, somewhere in Berlin, there's still a tunnel, empty now, abandoned, but permanent, a scar in the earth that says love was here, love dug, love refused to quit, and love, in the end, won.